Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 46 of Contemplating Life. This week we continue my nostalgic look back at my college days, specifically my second semester at IUPUI and my first ever programming class. We'll also recount the history of the first computers I ever used. As reported in previous episodes, I can handle logic problems, story problems, geometry, trigonometry, and algebra with little difficulty. But if you give me a column of numbers, I can add it up 3 times and get 3 different answers. I attribute this problem to my beloved third-grade teacher, Miss Holmes. She determined I was a gifted student, and she didn't want to burden me with the so-called busy work, like mindless, repetitive math and spelling drills. As a result, I'm terrible at basic arithmetic, and I can't spell to save my soul. Given these academic shortcomings, getting into computers was a natural for me because it required my logical thinking, and I let the computer do the grunt work of arithmetic, and years later, things like spell checking. I thought I would trace my early history with computers from the beginning. Somewhere along the way, I'm guessing about age 6 or 7, I was given a toy abacus. I believe it had about 6 or 7 columns of beads. The lower portion had 5 beads in each column, and above that were 2 beads. The lower beads were worth 1 each, and the upper ones worth 5 each. When the lower section filled up to 5, then you would throw one of the upper beads. When both upper beads were thrown, you would push them back and carry the 1 to the next column. It didn't take me very long to realize you really only needed 4 beads on the bottom and 1 on the top. Moving that 5th bead up, then only to immediately clear it and push the level 5 bead, was a wasted motion. Similarly, having 5 valued beads thrown only to reset them immediately to carry the 1 was a waste. I later learned that some abacuses are indeed built with only 1 upper bead and 4 lower beads. I've linked a couple of YouTube videos about abacus use. In one of them, a Chinese gentleman demonstrates a 2-5 Chinese abacus, but you'll notice he's only using 4 of the lower beads and 1 of the upper beads. I later learned that the 1-4 style is a Japanese abacus called a soroban. I never knew what they were called. I just played with it as a toy. In high school, I took a bookkeeping class, and we were allowed to use an adding machine, but I didn't have the physical strength to operate one. Of course, there were no pocket calculators in the early 1970s. I think the original pocket calculator, called the Bomar Brain, came out in my senior year of high school. It was a simple 4-function calculator with a red LED display, and it retailed for $240. One of my classmates in high school physics had one, and we were all very jealous. In my high school senior physics class, I learned how to use a slide rule. That ability alone was enough to brand you as an ultimate nerd. All I would have needed was a pocket protector and a piece of tape holding together my broken glasses to complete the picture. I didn't have either of those. My mom had a device that was a mechanical pocket-sized calculator called an addiator. I've linked some YouTube videos demonstrating these. The one I had was a little taller and narrower than the one in the video, but it worked exactly the same. It was made out of metal, perhaps aluminum or tin, and it had these sliding pieces that you would slide up and down with a metal stylus. You would put the stylus in a notch corresponding to your number. If that notch was shiny silver, you would drag it down. If it was tinted red, you would drag it up and over a hook to carry the 1. There was a sliding lever at the top that you could pull out to reset all the slides to 0. I barely had sufficient strength to operate it. If you didn't get the stylus in the hole and slide it as far as it was supposed to go, you wouldn't get the right answer. Or if the stylus slipped out of the hole, you would get totally lost and have to start over. And that would happen to me frequently. It didn't help my bookkeeping grades very much because it was just too hard to use. The first digital computer I owned was a toy called Digicomp 1. It was mostly plastic with a few metal pieces. There were some springs that would wear out, but you could replace them with rubber bands. I still have the device stashed away in a box in my room, but I'd have to do some restoration on it to get it working, so I didn't bother getting it out for this video. Fortunately, I found a YouTube video demonstrating it. As always, links in the description, or you're watching it right now if you're on the YouTube version of the podcast. Essentially, it was a 3-bit programmable computer. It would teach you binary logic functions such as and, or, not, or exclusive or. You would program it by placing these little short half-inch or 1-inch links of plastic tubing, kind of like a drinking straw, onto these little plastic pegs. There was a plastic tab hanging out the right side of the device that you would slide in and out. It was labeled the clock, and it simulated 1 clock cycle of a CPU. You could program to do binary arithmetic, but the most interesting thing it would do was that it would count from 0 through 7 in binary and then recycle to 0. There were little 0-1 stickers placed on it that would appear in a little window as the various pieces would slide back and forth. The sliding pieces were appropriately called flip-flops because they flipped and flopped back and forth on each cycle of the clock. What I did not know until years later that these pieces were emulating an electronic circuit, which is also called a flip-flop. The flip-flop is an essential component of computer electronics. I already described my first encounter with a real computer when my friend Dennis carried the teletype machine downstairs at Northwest High School for me to log into a Honeywell time-sharing computer located at the Indianapolis Public Schools Administration Building. In recent episodes, we talked about me tinkering around with the university's DEC System 10 computer via teletypes. However, my first programming class did not use that system. There were 2 other computers in the 38th Street Computer Center in the A building. The machine I used in my first programming class was an IBM System 360 Model 44. It was sold from 1965 through 1973. It was a specialized version of the IBM 360 architecture designed for scientific computing, real-time computing, process control, and numerical control. I wasn't aware it was such a strange variant of the system. I just remembered the model number, and I only learned of its specialized capabilities when researching this episode. I doubt we ever used any of those advanced features. Students did not have direct access to the 360. You would type your programs on punch cards and put them in a deck. There were specialized cards already punched for you called JCL cards. That stood for Job Control Language. You would put a few JCL cards on the top of your deck, and then the cards from your program that you had written, and then add specialized cards at the end to tell it that you're done and what to do with the program. You would wrap it in a rubber band and hand it to the computer operator through a window. I think you got some sort of a receipt with a job number on it so you could claim your output later. They would give you an estimate about how long you had to wait for your output, depending on how many jobs were in the queue ahead of you. You would come back perhaps maybe 30 minutes later, and they would hand you your output in the form of a double-wide green bar computer printout. You would unfold several fan-fold pages of computer printout only to find that you had made some small typographical error. You would have to replace that particular card and repeat the entire process. Now, many of my listeners may have no idea what I mean by an IBM punch card. So let me tell you the history of it as I learned it with a little help from Wikipedia. I'm not sure all of this is 100% accurate. Some of it is in the form of legend. The 1880 U.S. Census took 8 years to compile. Estimates were that it would take as long as 12 years to compile the 1890 census, at which point they'd be 2 years behind because it would be already time to do the 1900 census. An inventor named Herman Hollerith, who worked for the Census Bureau, came up with a system of recording data by punching holes in cardstock. It was originally inspired by punch cards used in the jacquard loom system for making fancy patterns in woven cloth. Hollerith developed automatic machines that would count or sort the cards depending on whether or not a hole was punched in a particular location. The 1890 census data was encoded on punch cards in this manner. The original cards were the size of a U.S. dollar bill at the time, because there was existing machinery available for handling paper that size. The 1890 census, although much larger and more detailed than the previous one, took only 6 years to tabulate using his machines. He eventually formed a company called the Tabulating Machine Company. That company later merged with 3 other companies to form the Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company. In 1927, that company was renamed International Business Machines, or IBM. The famous IBM cards used in early computers were first introduced in 1928 and quickly became the standard for all punch card data processing. They used a smooth, lightweight card stock, 0.007 inches thick. They measured 7 3/4 inches by 3 1/4 inches. Vertically oriented rectangular holes could be punched in an array of 80 columns by 12 rows. When we would type a computer program, each line of the program would be punched onto one card. We had 2 types of key punch machines at IUPUI, the O26 and the newer O29 machines. I don't recall the technical differences between the two. We had 2 or 3 of each of them, and either one would serve our purposes. After looking at photos of the machines I found online, I recalled that I preferred the O26 because the keyboard was on a short cable and you could move it around a bit. The O29 keyboard was not as flexible and was harder for me to reach. The rows of holes were numbered with 12 at the top, sometimes called the X row, followed by row 11, sometimes called the Y row, and then rows 0 through 9, with 9 at the bottom edge of the card. When you would load your deck of cards into a computer, the rule was that you put your deck face down, 9 edge first. That phrase was drilled into our heads repeatedly. I remember we had a humorous poem about a programmer who pulled several all-nighters trying to get the software to run before deadline. All I remember of the poem was the final 2 lines. He died at the console of hunger and thirst, was buried the next day, face down, 9 edge first. My transcript says I took 3 classes in my second semester, and we already discussed my second semester French class a couple of episodes ago. I also took Integral Calculus and Analytical Geometry, Math 163. It was my first calculus class ever, and I was awarded a B. I don't remember much about it, except that I never really understood calculus until I had to put it to use in physics class. The programming class I took my second semester was called Introduction to Algorithmic Processes, CSCI 220. It was taught by Dr. Larry Hunter. We learned fundamental programming techniques using a computer language called Fortran 4, which was very popular for science and engineering programming. We would write our programs in that language, punch them on cards, and run them on the IBM System 360. I think Professor Hunter had unfulfilled secret aspirations to be a stand-up comedian. He was a tall, thin man whose mannerisms mirrored that of Johnny Carson during a Tonight Show monologue. He held his posture very straight with his shoulders back and one hand in his pocket. He would gesture with his right hand while lecturing. When he would turn to write on the blackboard, it reminded me of Carson turning to say something to Ed McMahon. The mannerisms were identical. He would pepper his lectures with lots of jokes. In addition to learning Fortran programming, part of the lesson was how computer hardware works. We studied the details of Boolean logic and how it was emulated using the circuits in the computer. Complex layers of multiple Boolean operations are illustrated in something called a Carnot map, Karnaugh. We learned how to create and read Carnot maps. He also talked about how the computer architecture was laid out. You can't connect every piece of a computer to every other piece because it would be too complicated. Instead, computers use a system of parallel lines for transmitting data. It's called a data bus. Each component connects to the bus and communicates through it. He explained that the introduction of integrated circuits made this a necessity. Knowing the sense of humor he had, after class one day, I told him a couple of jokes based on those topics. I told him he would be free to use them in further lectures. The first joke was, I noted that having a data bus was necessary once computers were made out of integrated circuits instead of individual transistors. Could this be referred to as busing to achieve integration? Okay, if you don't get that joke, if you're too young, in the 1970s, district courts had ordered that children had to be bused from predominantly white schools into predominantly black schools in order to achieve racial diversity. That was busing to achieve integration. For my second joke, I wondered if Carnot maps would be on the final exam. If so, he was going to be testing our Carnot knowledge. If you don't get that joke, I can't help you. He really liked both of the jokes. He said that we were getting away from using Carnot maps, and he was considering dropping that from the curriculum. But now that he had a good joke to go with it, he might have to keep it around a little bit longer. I took that as a very high compliment. A couple of days later, he told both of the jokes in class and gave me credit for writing them. I can't say that I learned a lot in that class that I couldn't have taught myself from reading a book on Fortran, but that concept would be exploited in a later semester where the teacher would hand us the book and say, go teach yourself this course. Much more on that situation in later episodes. Now, there was another computer in the A building that I did not use for my programming class. It was an ancient IBM 1620. That machine was first introduced in 1959 and was popular through the early 60s. It was discontinued in 1970. You've probably seen one of them in old sci-fi movies. When they became obsolete, Many were sold to Hollywood as props. They have a large array of blinking lights on the front console and lots of switches. It established in the 1960s media what a computer looked like to the common man. I provide some photos in the YouTube version of the episode and articles linked in the description. It was not a very powerful computer. The Fortran compiler on it was only Fortran 2, and my class was using Fortran 4. We did spend some time learning the differences between the two versions of Fortran, but we were never assigned any programs written in Fortran 2. The hardware uses a strange format called binary coded decimal, or BCD. In computers today, numbers are encoded using strings of zeros and ones, perhaps 32 or 64 digits long, using base 2 arithmetic. So, for example, a 32-bit memory location could store a number from 0 to 65,535, or from negative 32,767 to plus 32,767. Floating point numbers are stored in a binary format in scientific notation, with the significant digits and the exponents stored separately. But the old 1620 didn't use binary numbers. It used decimal arithmetic. It would use 4 bits of data to encode the numbers 0 through 9. The other combinations of those bits were used as data separators or record separators. So in traditional computers, a 32-bit integer is limited to a maximum of 65,535. But in BCD, you can have a string of decimal digits as long as the entire memory of the computer, thousands of digits long. The number was delimited by a data separator. In theory, you could take two numbers, each of which was a string of digits slightly less than half the entire computer memory, leave room for some instructions to add them together, and it would do so. But strangely, this computer could not do arithmetic. It would add digits by looking up the answer in a table. It also stored a multiplication table and would do a table lookup rather than to do the actual computing of multiplying the numbers. Because the 1620 was outdated, most people were using either the IBM 360 or the remotely located DEC System 10. The 1620 didn't get much use. Mostly we just played around with it. We had hands-on access to the machine. They figured we couldn't hurt it. There was a program you could run on the machine that would put it into a tight loop of a particular duration. If you set an AM radio on the console and tuned it to a particular frequency, it would generate a buzzing noise in the radio from RF interference. Someone had written a program to vary the frequency of that buzz, and you could play music. They had several songs already programmed. There was no documentation available, but I easily reverse engineered the system they had for encoding the notes, and I encoded a different song. I don't recall what it was, but I think it might have been a Christmas carol. I'm not sure which one. Attached to the machine was a line printer that would print out your program for you, or any other output. We had collections of decks of cards that would print so-called ASCII art. That's where you use different characters to vary the darkness of a particular square on the page. Sometimes you would overprint large characters to make them darker, such as printing an M on top of an X or a W to make the dark areas darker, and use periods or commas or blanks to make light areas. We had all of the traditional computer images of the time, including a Mona Lisa picture, and a picture of a pinup girl, naked. See the links in the description for examples of ASCII art. The only students who really used the old 1620 for actual classwork were freshman engineering students taking a course called Engineering 109. It was a course in Fortran 2 taught by an engineering professor who apparently didn't know crap about how to teach programming. The computer science students, like myself, would get inundated with questions from the engineering students. After living through this for several semesters, I developed a plan. At the start of a new semester, when one of the engineering students asked me a question, I told him, "Come back to the computer center tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bring one or two of your classmates. I'm going to teach you computer programming." At the appropriate time, we found a corner of the computer center, and in about 90 minutes, I taught them the basics of Fortran programming. The universal reaction was, "Why the hell didn't the professor just explain it that way?" I told these 2 or 3 students they had to pay it forward. From now on, they had to help their classmates and leave the rest of the computer science people alone. It worked beautifully. They didn't bug us anymore. I did that again for 2 or 3 of my last semesters. I'd take one day, teach a couple of them the basics, and then they would just pay it forward. Now fast forward nearly 50 years later. I met a young lady named Jenica who has the same disability I have, spinal muscular atrophy. I met her and her mother in a Facebook group on assistive technology. Jenica was taking electrical engineering classes at a Purdue Extension campus in southern Indiana, near the Ohio River. They were teaching her C++ programming on Arduino microcontrollers, the kind of which I use for developing assistive technology. And she was struggling with the class. For me, it was deja vu all over again. Here was an engineering student learning programming from an engineering professor who didn't know how to teach the subject. I spent perhaps 3 or 4 sessions with her on video chat on Facebook Messenger, doing for her what I'd done for those engineering E109 students nearly 50 years ago. At one point, everything fell into place and she got it. Although I checked with her several times after that last lesson, she insisted she now understood what she was doing. And similarly, she was paying it forward by teaching the other students in the class. Now, although we're a bit off topic here, I have to tell you that Jenica is my hero. And the reason is a story that she told me. When she was in high school, she took an electronics course where she was the only girl among about 30 boys. When it came time to learn soldering, the teacher was concerned and asked her if she could handle a soldering iron. She said, "I got this," and she had no difficulty using the device. Meanwhile, there were boys in the class who were a bit squeamish about wielding a device that heats up to 350 or 400 degrees. Her teacher pointed out to him that Jenica was having no difficulty using a soldering iron. They were embarrassed, not only that they were being shown up by a girl, but moreover, a girl in a wheelchair. They had to grow a pair really quickly. I laughed so hard I cried. I told her what an amazing person she is. I wish I could have been there to see the look on their face when she was doing something they were scared to do. Anyway, back to my story. The next course in the curriculum was CSCI 300, Assembly Language Programming. The problem was that course was only offered in the spring semester. I couldn't take it in the fall for my 3rd semester of college. That's how they screwed me up, by not allowing me to take that first CS 220 in my 1st semester. It got me out of sync with the way that the classes were offered. So I decided that for my third semester, I would primarily spend my time at the downtown campus, picking up several liberal arts classes to fulfill those requirements. Next week, we'll talk about my third semester and the adventures I had at the downtown campus. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I have some financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money. But then again, every little bit helps. My deepest thanks, as always, to all of my financial supporters. Your support pays for this writing seminar that I attend and many other things. But most of all, it shows how much you care and appreciate what I'm doing. Your support always means way more to me than I could ever put into words. Even if you cannot provide financial support, I'm begging you as always, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to be able to hear my stories. All of my back episodes are available, and I encourage you to check them out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you find the podcast. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating your life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.